David, you look very lovely.
Well, it's a
today.
special event, let's face it. It's my first visit to FrightFest for ages, so I thought I'd put on a bit of an effort.
And you're being acknowledged, aren't you, today? Tell us more about that acknowledgement.
Well, long ago, I made a mockumentary called Horror Icon, and it's just been shown in there. It's being released as an extra with my DVD Worst Fears, which I believe is out on September the 3rd. So we were just having a bit of a party in there to celebrate.
What is it about, you mean you've worked in horror for a long time. What is it about horror as a genre that makes it special for you?
Do you know, I think this goes back to when I was probably about 8 or 9. It's probably the same story for everyone. My father used to take me up to London's West End to look at the sights, and all I was interested in was the posters and the photos outside cinemas showing horror films. And in those days, you know, it was a giant spider or hideously misshapen men. And I thought, oh, this is terrifying. I knew then I wanted to be part of it. I was so thrilled that my first major horror film, House of Whipcord, showed at the London Pavilion where Tarantula was on in the late 50s, and that was probably one of the highlights of my life.
I mean, filmmaking has become so much easier for filmmakers now with technology. Is this a good time for film and for people to start making films and be more involved?
It was so difficult when I was younger. I mean, the industry was unionized. I've got nothing against unions, but it meant that you just couldn't make low-budget films unless you went under the radar, like all the people I worked with, Norman J. Warren, Pete Walker. They had to make films secretly. Now, that's not the problem anymore. You don't have to use celluloid anymore. It's a marvelous time to get out there and make horror films. But good ones, please.
Well, it is all about the story, isn't it?
Always, yes. It always comes back to the screenplay. And when I was answering readers' questions for a magazine called Film Review, people used to send me in their screenplays, and I got lots and lots of them. And I have to say, I had to be very honest with them, and not one of them was ever produced. It's harder than you think to write a really scary horror film. I doubt even if I could do it anymore. It's a young person's thing. I want to see all those young people out there writing brilliantly scary horror films, because I'll come and see them.
So we're here for a special event. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, basically, we're Nucleus Films and we're releasing David McGillivray's Worst Fears anthology collection, and we just did a screening of one of the extras, Horror Icon, and I think you just spoke to David, and he's quite a character, but he's the man that's responsible for Mark Morris being in the film industry.
Yeah,
Tell us
he
more.
is. I first met him, I think, back in the late 80s, and he said to me, why aren't you working in the film business? Because I was a draftsman back in those days. He said, why don't you get a job in the...
cruising in a gay club.
No, I wasn't cruising. We just met in a restaurant somewhere. And he encouraged me to write off to all these film companies. Eventually, I landed a job in the film business. So, you know, he helped me construct a letter and send about 20 letters off. I think most of them said no, bugger off. But eventually one said, OK, we'll give you a try.
You know, I think what's particularly unique with horror is this kind of... There is a sense that everybody wants to support each other and help each other, don't they?
Yeah, I think that the horror scene is a fantastic scene, and there's some really interesting characters in the scene, and once you get to know people, they really are very helpful, and you see the same people around all the time, and you come to a place like FrightFest, and there is a sort of a real family feel within the genre, which I think surprises people who don't like horror films, because they always expect that the people who like horror are going to be, you know, like strange in some way. And maybe we are a bit strange, but in a nice way.
What's interesting with horror film, that it isn't just about slashers and making people jump. There's normally a very kind of profound subtext, isn't there, through the film, or some sort of social commentary or something, isn't there?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's just a really nice atmosphere here, and everyone's enjoying the movies and getting into the spirit of the festival. Really, it's really nice.
But in those terms, though, but I mean, David's early films, like, you know, he's a legend of
Horror.
British cinema, but his Pete Walker stuff did have a lot of social commentary,
Really did,
but he was always very much interested in actually sort of winding up the establishment and annoying them. And I think that's one of the great things about a character like David McGillivray. He's a big character, and he's a very interesting man who did a lot of stuff to. And, you know, in some ways, a lot of people disliked him for many years, in fact.
Lots of good, juicy gossip as well.
Did he say anything? Yeah.
No, he didn't. I didn't ask him.
He didn't know an autobiography, but he's had to he changed names, and he said he can only really mention people who are dead, and all the people who are still living, he's changed their names into pseudonyms, which you can quite easily guess.
You should interview him again and tell him you're not rolling and roll, and then you'll get the real story.
See, he's got stories of, you know, it'd be an interesting book to read if it does eventually come out.
And with regards to your documentary, tell us more about what inspired you there, really. I mean, obviously he's an inspirational man, but it also takes time and money and investment, doesn't it?
Well, it was an interesting thing because the documentary it's not quite the same sort of documentary you would expect, because it was shot about 8 or 9 years ago, and it's actually got footage from FrightFest when it was at the Odeon West End. So if you went to that, you may see yourself. We filmed the audience. We didn't film it. It's actually something. The documentary is something that David shot, and then he kind of abandoned it because he didn't think it would work. And then when he asked us whether we would release the films, because he wanted to release the anthology, the whole set, we were saying, well, what extra material could we do? And he said, well, I've got all of this footage, but no one ever edited it. And it was scripted out as well.
Of unedited footage on all really old formats under his stairs.
So basically, we got given like a box of tapes, and we sat through it and went through hours of all the stuff that he thought, and we put this thing together, which is something that David had in mind many years ago. And you'll see that it's a bit more along the lines of a mockumentary in a sense.
But all the people in it can't even remember doing it because it was that long ago. They just forgot they forgot even being in it, and they just couldn't believe it, could they?
Yeah, but you've got all of the sort of usual faces, usual suspects like Alan Jones and Kim Newman, Norman Warren, Fenella Fielding, and they're all sort of good sports about it. And like I say, it's an interesting one because it's not like not quite a normal documentary, and we didn't make it. We just constructed it. But on the disc there is some other documentary stuff with David talking about actually making the films. So it's a great package.
Loads and loads of little extras, little featurettes to sort of tell you about the extras and the main film.
So if you're a fan of David McGillivray, and also if you're a fan, maybe you're just a filmmaker who's trying to make films, David gives a lot. He's very candid in how he made these films for no money, etc. So it's actually worth watching for that as well. And David's very entertaining. In fact,
he doesn't take himself seriously at all. He's always joking around, making wisecracks, isn't he?
In fact, look, pan over to him. Look, he's probably wisecracking now.
He looks very serious now, actually. Yeah, he's concentrating, you can tell.
Serious,
yeah, he does.
So that's completely ruined again by David.
So where can we see this document? I mean, it's been here, a screening at FrightFest, but for people that aren't lucky enough to be here.
September the 5th, it's out in the shops, Amazon, HMV, all the usual places.
But if you're at FrightFest, when you're watching this, you probably won't be at FrightFest, but if you are at FrightFest and it's still going on for a day, Harvey Fenter's selling advanced copies, which you can get signed. Signed by
the man
himself. You've had a long working relationship with David, who's been acknowledged as well today.
Well, I've known David a very long time. I think it's about 50 odd years now. But when you say, no, I haven't worked with him that often, the first two of the horror films I did in the beginning, Satan, Slave and Terror, he wrote the script of both of those. But sadly, I don't know why we didn't get to work it together again, but I've known him, and we've often been involved in sort of little short projects. Either he's come along and appeared in something that I've been doing, or vice versa.
It's interesting you say that, because you think of horror being such a small community of people that you would think you would always be working together.
Yes, I mean, you're right, it is a very small community, but I just don't know why it happens, just that David didn't get the chance to do the script. I think it's because the two films I did with him, they were made independently by myself and the producers of them. Whereas a lot of the other horror films I did, I was the hired hand. By that I mean, it was people that came to me and asked me to direct their film. So they normally had a script already. There was no opportunity to bring another writer or bring in David.
And what is it about horror that for you that is such a special genre?
Well, obviously, like a lot of people, it was a genre I loved from a young boy. I never sort of grew out of it. But as a filmmaker, because I have done other sort of straight dramas, the nice thing I like about horror is the fact that it gives you complete freedom of imagination. The straight dramas, if it's in reality, you're locked into reality. You know, you can't do certain things because that's not real. Whereas in horror, you have total no reason why you can't do something.
And I'd imagine as well, censorship isn't the same as what it was back then. So how did you? Because for us, we don't really know about the censorship in the same way as you guys did back then. So did you find that quite inhibiting at the time?
It was in some ways, although you sort of knew what was acceptable and wasn't acceptable. I mean, I started off getting my opportunity to direct. I did do what we call sexploitation films. So I got to know the censor, John Trevelyan, as he was in those days, very well. And he was very good. Unlike later censors, you could actually talk to him because he loved films. And he would say, well, depending on how you shoot that, I mean, he'd look at the script. He'd say, you may be careful because you could get into trouble. So there were certain guidelines that you knew. And of course, in my first days in the 70s, one of the first horror films, it was the days of doing alternative versions. So we very often did shoot a scene twice, you know, where we do it for the UK market, which was quite sort of respectable. And then we do the overseas version, which usually just meant having people with less clothing on and throwing a hell of a lot of blood around or whatever, you know. And that usually worked, because at one time Japan demanded all that. You could never be gory enough for Japan. They always said more, you know. So there's censorship, you just managed to work around it. But as you say, it was completely different because now it's freedom, you know. I think you still, I mean, I don't know, but I think you would still, if you go too far, you might actually get a problem with getting it through, or release onto DVD or something. You know, so.
Are there any kind of films that you've seen over the years that particularly excited you from horror filmmakers?
Well, the ones I tend to like have come from, I mean, I like some of the European films, like I said, the Spanish films, things like The Orphanage, and then things like Let the Right One In, but then also like the Asian films like The Eye, and things like that. You know, I find those really exciting. Sadly, a lot of the new American horror, I'm not so keen on, only because it seems to be just a reworking of the same thing over and over again. And also, I'd say with British horror, I would like someone actually to come along now and just find a different way. I know it's very hard to be original, but just a slightly different slant, you know. I'm saying that because my own history on that is my first film, Satan's Slave. We were influenced by Hammer, which was the big film company at the day, but we managed to steer it. Hammer was always set in a period that was gone. It was everybody, you know, like in horses and carriages, and they were all living in wonderful houses, seemed to have incredible lives, but nobody seemed to do any work, you know, and yet they were all incredibly rich. So, and it was the audience of the day really couldn't relate to it. So with Satan's Slave, we brought it in today, up the gore a bit, of course, and made it the person living next door. So, you know.
Which makes it even more scary.
Oh, it is, but that's what I meant about someone coming up with it, just now taking horror just a slightly different way, you know.
Will be exciting, and we're here at FrightFest, which is a great platform, isn't it, for young filmmakers to get their work showcased?
Absolutely. I now think this is probably the most important actually horror festival to be. If you can get your film accepted for FrightFest, you're on your way. I really do. And of course, what's lovely here, the audience, your fans, it's all fans, so you know you will get a very good response. You know.